obvious, right? But with the power of the half-whole scale, we can do this. If you're new to MDEX Music, we create music books and apps, piano arrangements, and we discuss improvisation, songwriting, and sometimes we take music theory to strange and uncharted places. So subscribe and hit the bell, and join us for exclusive access to our ever-expanding library of music resources. This is the half-whole scale, also known as the symmetric diminished or the half-diminished scale. It's built using a simple formula. You can start on any note and then play a repeated pattern of half step followed by a whole step. When we look at the modes of this scale, we see it as an 8-note symmetric scale. Symmetric meaning it has fewer modes than notes. In fact, this scale is so symmetric that it just contains 2 modes, itself, the half whole, and the whole half scale, also known as the diminished scale. Look, if we start the C half-whole scale on the second note, we get a D-flat whole half. Of course, this is obvious when we look at the intervallic formula. A repeating half-whole pattern merely turns into a repeating whole half pattern, and there are no other possible modes. You can also see this clearly when we rotate the graph over the circle of fifths. There's only 2 ways in which we can draw this graph within the circle no matter how much we turn it around. Now, the half-whole scale, as we talked about ad nauseum in our channel, is a great scale for dominant chords. The C half-whole creates a very interesting sound over a C7, and it resolves beautifully to an F major. It also reveals relationships between dominant substitutions in the tritone system. Since this scale is symmetric, containing 8 notes and only 2 modes, every other note could be the root of the scale. In other words, if I play this, we can't tell if this is a C half-whole or an E flat half-whole, or an F sharp, or an A half-whole scale. They're all the same exact notes. That doesn't really happen to the major scale, which is not symmetric. If I play a C major scale, you know it's a C major scale. No other major scale is built with these notes. Of course, it could be a D Dorian or an E Phrygian and so on, but as a major Ionian scale, there's only one option. It has to be a C major scale. But the half-whole is symmetric, so every other mode has the same intervallic formula and cannot be distinguished from the rest. So a C half diminished could be an F sharp half diminished. Since the C half diminished works well over a C7, then it should work perfectly on an F sharp 7 as well. And we can use this information to reharmonize any C7 with an F sharp 7. This F sharp 7 is of course the sub 5 in the key of F. It is the tritone substitution of the C7 in that key. Of course, expanding on this concept, we could also try reharmonizing a C7, the 5-7 in the key of F, with an E flat 7, the flat 7 of the key. And as you can see, it works great. We could also consider reharmonizing the C7 with an A7. This is a much harder reharmonization to pull off, but in a way, we can see it as the 5-7 of 6, D minor, which is the other tonic chord in F major, and use it to create a deceptive resolution. But this isn't the only way that we can use the half-whole scale to relate harmonic functions. Another interesting perspective is to consider the other mode of this scale, the whole half, or the diminished scale. If we start the C half-whole on the second note, we get a D flat, or C sharp, diminished scale. And every other note will be yet another diminished scale. So C sharp whole half is the same as E whole half, G whole half, and B flat whole half. And any of these notes could be the root of the scale. What's cool about this perspective is that it works great over diminished chords. And that's because in a diminished chord, any note a whole step above a chord tone is an available tension. In a C sharp diminished 7, a whole step above C sharp is D sharp. Above E, you have F sharp. Above G is the A, and above the B flat, you have C. So in a diminished 7 chord, all the chord tones with all of the available tensions spell out the whole half scale. Now, if we look at our original C7 paired with the half whole, and then consider the whole half starting, for example, on the E, we have a great scale to play over an E diminished 7, which is the 7 diminished 7 of the key of F. So our C half whole over C7 contains the same notes as the E whole half over E diminished 7. And this perspective shows us the relationship between the 5-7 C7 and the 7 diminished E diminished 7. What's cool about diminished 7 chords, much like the two scales that we're discussing today, is that they're also symmetric, fewer modes than notes. Actually, there's only one mode of this note grouping. What this means is that any note in a diminished 7 chord could be the root of the note grouping. When you invert a diminished 7 chord, you get another diminished 7 chord made up of the same exact notes. Seeing this opens the door to even more potential reharmonizations. Not only could you substitute the C7 out for E diminished 7, but G diminished 7, or B flat diminished 7, or C sharp diminished 7 as well. And all of these are paired with the same whole half scale. Remember, the E, G, B flat, and C sharp whole half scales are all the same exact note grouping. In fact, they're also the same exact note grouping as the C half whole scale. So this one simple scale allowed us to arrive at all these amazing and different places. Pairing the symmetric diminished scale with your dominant chords not only gives you amazing sounds and colors to explore, but it also, in and of itself, is a literal list of potential substitutions. Every odd note in the scale represents the roots of other dominant chords you can play, and every even note of the scale represents the roots of diminished 7 chords that you can use for substitutions. Let's take a look at how to apply this to I Love You. Here we have a 2-5 in F, G minor 7 flat 5, C7 to F. Now, let's pair the C7 with the symmetric diminished scale. Now, using the scale as a reference, I see we have as dominant options E flat 7, G flat 7, and A7. And as diminished options, we have C sharp diminished 7, E diminished 7, G diminished 7, and B flat diminished 7. Let's try a few of these out. And don't forget, we're pairing every single one of these chords with the same exact note grouping. All the notes that are found in the C symmetric diminished scale. Your perspective might change. For example, from C half whole to E flat half whole to E whole half or even G whole half, but they're all made up of the same exact notes. Some of these substitutions will work a lot better than others, and there's a very good reason for that we'll explain in another video. But I encourage you to explore all of the reharms that we talked about today and see which ones are your favorite. And let us know down in the comments below which dominant chord reharm works best and why. And for our exclusive access members, we've included a PDF of all the available dominant and diminished substitutions in every key. And if you're not a member yet, you can join right now by clicking on the join button or by using the provided link.